Good afternoon. My name is Becky Gray, and on behalf of all of my colleagues at the John Locke Foundation, let me welcome you to what we hope is going to be a very important, very thoughtful discussion this afternoon. I'll let you in on a little secret. The way this kind of came about, those of you who read Carolina Journal regularly, and if you don't, you ought to. Everyone's got a copy of it, that reads the John Locke Foundation research information, follows us on Twitter, follows the work that we're doing at the General Assembly. You all know that one of the issues that has been pretty hotly debated at the General Assembly is judicial elections, judicial selection. How do we do it in North Carolina? How does that differ from other states? What is the best way to do it? Everything from redrawing judicial districts to how we elect judges. And one of the things that troubled us a little bit as we followed this debate, reported on it, done analysis, is in many of this, and particularly in the newspapers and all, it really seems to have taken on a very political stint and tilt on the discussions that have happened, where if Republicans come up with an idea, Democrats immediately say that's a terrible idea, and vice versa, and it's become a very political discussion where we really believe this is an important issue for North Carolina. How we elect judges, who those judges are, is a very important part of our state government. So what we decided to do was to put together a very thoughtful discussion of this issue that raises it above that political infighting that you've seen. So I hope that you find this beneficial. I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to recognize one of the sponsors for the event. Steve Long with Warden Smith is over here. Thank you, Steve, so much for your support and your interest in this. And also our partnership with Western Carolina University with Dr. Ed Lopez, who is a professor of economics, BB&T Distinguished Professor of Capitalism, and Director of the Center for the Study of Free Enterprise at Western Carolina. So, Dr. Lopez, thank you for being here, for co-sponsoring the event. And also leading the beautiful North Carolina mountains to be with us in Raleigh today. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lopez, and thank you all so much for being here. I'm looking forward to sitting back and just learning. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Becky.
Thank you.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many faces in the room, and I believe not too many familiar faces, because as Becky mentioned, I came all the way from the mountains of Western Carolina to be with you here today. And also, well, I wanted first, in addition to thanking you for attending, also thank the Campbell Law School, the Norman Adrian Wiggins Law School, for hosting us and providing the venue. So Becky mentioned, my name is Edward Lopez, and I'm the director of the Center for Study of Free Enterprise at Western Carolina University. Western's Board of Trustees established the Center for Study of Free Enterprise. In December of 2015, we began operations in the fall of 2016, so we're now completing our first academic year of operations. Our mission is to support research and education on issues pertaining to economic development, public policies, and the role of free enterprise in a flourishing society. This is our first event in Raleigh, and we're both pleased and fortunate to have the John Locke Foundation as our co-sponsors, in addition to the firm Warden Smith. Thanks very much. And we're also very fortunate to have this distinguished panel of speakers here with us. As Becky mentioned, the purpose of today's discussion is educational. We're here not necessarily to advocate a particular system of judicial selection or a particular model or a particular point of view, especially particular political point of view. But instead, we're here to discuss the legal and social science scholarship on judicial selection. The goal of this is to further our mutual understanding of alternative systems for selecting judges, and thereby to contribute to the public discussion in our state on this very important policy decision. As moderator, I will be very interested in the topic, but I'm also going to resist the urge to insert my own remarks at this time, partly because we have a very full panel. So instead, I'd like to move on with the pleasure of introducing our speakers today. Professor Chris Bono is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh, where he has taught since 2002. He is the author of 3 books, the editor of 2 others, and has published numerous scholarly articles in chapters and scholarly journals. He is one of the country's leading experts on the politics of judicial elections, having spoken before numerous judges, legislators, and attorneys. Professor Bono teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses. Subjects include judicial politics and political science and empirical research. He holds a PhD in political science from Michigan State University. From 2013 to 2014, he was co-director of the Center for American Politics and Society, CAPS. Speaking next will be Professor Scott Gaylord, who joined the Elon faculty in 2007 and was granted tenure in 2012. Since 2014, he has been a professor of law, serving as the Jennings Professor and Emerging Scholar from 2013 to 2015. Prior to joining the Legal Academy, he practiced with the Charlotte firm of Robinson, Bradshaw, and Hinson. Before that, Professor Gaylord served as a law clerk to Judge Edith Jones on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. He received his master's and doctoral degrees in philosophy from UNC Chapel Hill and is a summa cum laude graduate of Notre Dame Law School, where he was book review editor for the Law Review and received the Dean Joseph O'Meara Award as salutatorian. Next up will be Professor Brian Mccann, who is Assistant Professor of Economics at West Virginia University and faculty affiliate of the Center for Free Enterprise at WVU. His research interests are in public choice and law and economics. Specifically, he is interested in the incentives of the actors within the legal system and how political institutions shape them. His current work investigates the selection mechanism used to choose the leadership of public defender offices. Professor Mccann holds a PhD in economics from Pennsylvania State University. Previously, he was an assistant professor at Elmira College and Wake Forest University, and an associate professor at St. Bonaventure University. Moving on to our 4th speaker, Gregory Wallace is a professor of law at Campbell University School of Law, where he teaches constitutional law with an emphasis on free speech, church and state, and right to arms. He received his JD with high honors from the University of Arkansas Little Rock School of Law. He then obtained his LLM and SJD degrees from the University of Virginia School of Law. He also has an MA degree with honors from Dallas Theological Seminary. Before joining the Campbell Law faculty in 1995, Professor Wallace served as a law clerk to the United States District Judge Susan Weber Wright. He was the only law professor to serve on the North Carolina Supreme Court Advisory Committee on Permissible Political Conduct by Judges and Judicial Candidates. Professor Wallace has published several academic articles on religious freedom, free speech, and cultural issues involving constitutional law. He provides frequent commentary on constitutional issues at conferences and symposia, as well as in news reports, talk radio, and op-ed columns. He is a regular contributor to thehill.com. I also should mention that Professor Greg Wallace is here on very short notice because unfortunately we had a panelist who was scheduled to be with us today, Professor Andrew Hansen from Clemson University. He's an economist who does a lot of work on judicial selection mechanisms, but unfortunately came down with he's one of our last flu cases for the season and was unable to travel and be with us today, so we wish him well on a speedy recovery. Just a quick note, we will proceed with each speaker in alphabetical order, giving just 10 or 12 minutes for each, and then I will moderate responses from the panelists and questions or comments from the floor. With that, I'm happy to turn it over, and I ask you to help me welcome Professor Chris Bono.
Thank you very much. The good thing about going first is you're not bored yet, you're all awake. The bad thing is then you'll get a bunch of people telling you why I'm wrong. So I'm going to make 3 brief points and then turn it over to my colleagues. Before I make my points, though, the first thing I want to stress is that there's no perfect system of judicial selection. Now, every system of judicial selection has its strengths and has its weaknesses. So there's no perfect system out there that if we just chose one, all of our problems would magically go away. And so it's important to keep in mind. And relatedly, when I give these talks in states outside of Pennsylvania, invariably somebody will say, oh, you're coming down here telling us what to do. I don't care what you do. I have a 7 o'clock flight. I get to go back. I care what Pennsylvania does. But what I hope to do, though, is provide you with some information that scholars have found about judicial selection that will help the voters and the legislators of North Carolina make a choice that's best for the people of North Carolina. One of the great things about federalism is states are free to choose a variety of different things that work for them. And what works in Pennsylvania may not work in North Carolina. Or the voters in Pennsylvania, the legislators in Pennsylvania may want something different than down in North Carolina. But whatever system we choose, we should do so on the basis of facts. So I want to make a case for the current system of partisan elections. And I'm going to make that case based on 3 points. First, partisan elections provide the courts with an independent system of power and authority that you don't get with appointed systems. Legislators get their power from the people. The people elect the legislators, they can vote them in, they can vote them out. Same thing with the executive. With partisan elections, you get that same kind of authority with the judiciary. It gives the judiciary an independent source of power by which to make its decisions. It's not contingent on the other branches of government. In the current federal system, judicial selection is done by the other 2 branches of government. And if they can't agree, or if they decide not to hold votes, or they decide to stonewall for days, weeks, months, hypothetically even a year, there's no recourse. There's no independent source of power that derives from this judicial selection except in an elected system. Second, transparency. There's no apolitical method of judicial selection either. Politics is always involved when we're talking about selecting judges. So the question is, do you want your politics up front, invisible and transparent, or do you want them behind closed doors? If we think about the U.S. Supreme Court, here we have a very political method of selection where a lot of the politics is behind closed doors. We have highly qualified people receiving 30 plus no votes. Or you have a highly qualified person not even receiving a vote. Right? Why? Politics is involved in judicial selection. And this is okay. Those of you who are attorneys in the room know that when you go into the courtroom and you see the judge you're appearing before, you either feel really good or not so good. Because people's experiences shape how they view the law. People's view of what the role of a judge is, what the court is, shapes how they view the law. Well-meaning, smart, nice, kind people have fundamental disagreements on outcomes of cases, particularly at the appellate level, where these cases aren't easy. Because if these cases were easy, they would have been decided already. Right? So with judicial elections, you get transparency. You get the politics out in front. You can decide which candidate better fits how you think the law should be decided. Which candidate has a view that's most consistent with how things ought to go in this state. And third, why partisan elections, not nonpartisan elections, information. Party ID is the single most important piece of information any voter can have in any election. We're in a time now where the parties have sorted. The days of conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans are basically over. Right? Any Democrat is going to be more liberal than any Republican, on average. I'm sure you can give me an example of why I'm wrong, but again, on average, I'm right. So, because this information is important and relevant, and because we know that Democrats and liberals see the law differently than conservatives and Republicans. Again, that's perfectly acceptable, reasonable, and defensible. Right? We should not run away from that. With partisan elections, we give that information to the voter, so the voter can decide, right, on pieces of a meaningful base of information, just as they can decide for state legislative races, gubernatorial races, senatorial races, any other thing. Right? Party matters. It's an important informational cue. So those are the 3 reasons in brief why I think partisan elections are the way to go. And I'm happy to take questions and comments and everything else afterwards. One thing I want to close with, though, is that what's important in North Carolina, I think, as an outsider, is, right, let me bust out y'all need to pick a system and stick to it. Right? North Carolina is not unusual in that there have been attempts to change the method of judicial selection in recent years. North Carolina is unusual, though, in the fact that you've succeeded. right? So since 2000, we've gone from partisan to nonpartisan, to public financing, to non-public financing, back to partisan, maybe now to one of these 4 plans that are based on colors. You need to pick it, right? If we're concerned about the legitimacy of courts, right, we need to protect them, right? And what that means is we can't simply change the method of selection or change how the courts function simply because we don't like the outcomes we're getting from decisions, or we're worried we're not going to win elections, right? Institutions matter, and they matter, right, for a functioning democratic system. And part of the joy and messiness of a democratic system is that sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. Absent compelling evidence that there's something fundamentally wrong with how the system is working, we ought not be rushing into changing things every couple of years simply because we're worried that the next time around we won't be in control of the legislature or we won't control the governor's seat, whatever else. That is the most fundamental threat to the legitimacy of the court and the fundamental legitimacy of the court. And so I would just say, given that we just changed in North Carolina, well, you just changed in North Carolina in 2015, to change again so soon, to me, would require very compelling information, or we really risk doing long-term damage to the health of the judiciary in North Carolina. Thanks. Talk to you all later. Oh, and next up, my friend Scott Gaylord.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me all right with this stuff? Should I put this mic on as well? Put this one. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to attend, and I want to thank the John Locke Foundation and Western Carolina for giving time and attention to this really important issue for our state. I'm here at Elon University in North Carolina. I'm proud to be so, and have been involved in the discussions, as Chris said, lots of different jumping here and there, probably for the last decade or so, and trying to help analyze and think about some of these issues. And I think it's really important before we change the system, Chris talking about this idea of shifting that's been around for 150 years. Right, that we pay careful attention and really think about what are the benefits and alleged or perceived deficiencies, and how any changes are meant to correct those deficiencies, what they be, and if we're going to put a new system in, what other burdens or benefits there, a lot of weighing. And so as you go through, and for me, so since my perspective, I guess I sort of share Churchill's view of democracy. It's the worst form of government except for all the others. For judicial elections, I'm sort of a supporter of judicial elections. Again, no perfect system in place, but there are a lot of benefits to it when you balance. And as you assess what method you think is appropriate, I think it's really important on the front end to start thinking about what are the values that we're trying to address? What are the important considerations here? And different people will have different lists of those values. I like to think about judicial independence, at a minimum, judicial independence, accountability of the judiciary, separation of powers more generally, and legitimacy of the court. You can add other things in there as well, depends how you define some of these things. But it's important not just think which one do I like or not, especially as Chris was talking about in relation to what gives me outcomes that I like, but more about institutionally the system itself. What are we trying to do? And in the time I have with you this morning for opening remarks, I'd like to focus a little bit on the history of judicial elections. Again, we've had them for 150 years. These just didn't sprout out of whole cloth at some point in time. There's a history of the nation in terms of developing. Most of us probably most familiar with the federal model. But the states did things differently in the beginning than the federal model. Most of them did, the majority did. And the transition, the overwhelming number of states, the vast majority shift to judicial elections in the mid-19th century for, I think, very important reasons. And with our legislature considering a whole variety of plans, but at least a couple of those which deal with legislative elections. Now South Carolina and Virginia have legislative appointments. It seems to have worked for them okay. Again, different models, different ways to do it, but that's the vast minority of jurisdictions using that method. And why is that? And I think history gives us some clues and some concerns about that. So, in analyzing it, I don't know if, for you, if you're a constitutional law geek like I am, you may have your favorite Federalist or Anti-Federalist paper. Favorite quotes from one of mine is from Madison's Federalist number 51, "If men were angels," quote, right? He says, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." Actually, a lot of important points. But in terms of separation of powers, one, you got to be able to control the governed. And so coming off the Articles of Confederation, obviously a very weak central government, the unicameral system's not working, state-centric, federal government can't get anything done. So Article 1, Article 2, Article 3 of the federal Constitution, load up the federal side a little bit, give it more power. Our focus in the terms of judicial selection, how do you get the government to control itself, right? What are you going to do in terms of separation of powers? What's the proper relationship, the proper balance? And John Locke, the philosopher, not the foundation, back in 1690, right, expressly talks about the need to separate executive and legislative functions. Fast forward 1748, Montesquieu throws in the judiciary, right? Has 3 different branches. Blackstone does it, Madison does it, Adams does it. A lot of folks really concerned about that because if not, as Madison talks about in Federalist 47, you're going to end up with tyranny. If any 2 branches come together, Montesquieu talks about, and so does Madison, right, you're going to have a tyrannical situation, right? And the judiciary obviously going to be important in that. So what is the proper relationship between and among the different branches of government with respect to it? And that requires us to focus on the judicial function. Dig back in historical analysis, right? Marbury versus Madison, Chief Justice Marshall is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Really important, right? The power of judicial review is critical. Nowadays, some view the Supreme Court as the most powerful branch, right? Those appointments, Gorsuch versus Garland, very political, very important for the nation, right? Think about how important that is. Certainly going on at the time and worried about how the judiciary is going to serve as a check on the other branches. I'm always concerned with who's going to check the judiciary, right? How are we going to do that? Justice Jackson famously said, right, we're not final because we're infallible. We're infallible because we're final. We're the last arbiter of all things constitutional. Whatever we say goes, right? We get the 5-4, you've got control over it. But is that the proper way to have it? Do we want some type of check? And there's disagreement at the founding. As the Supreme Court talked about recently in a case, Williams-Yulee versus Florida Bar, 2015 case. It was a speech case dealing with judicial solicitations, which obviously is an important issue in judicial elections. But the court recognized that this issue about judicial elections goes back over 200 years to Hamilton and Jefferson. They didn't get along for a lot. Everyone's seen, the musical with Hamilton. They didn't play nicely together, in the sandbox a lot. And this is another area where they had fundamental disagreements. Hamilton's going to articulate and advocate for the federal model, right? The way with the system probably a lot of us are very familiar with. Jefferson, in his writings by 1816, is expressing grave concerns about having this the judiciary and the Supreme Court in particular with so much power and so much ability. He says, the complete independence of judges can make them, quote, dependent on none but themselves, end quote, and runs counter to the principle, quote, of a government founded on the public will. Right? The people are the source of all power. As Chris is talking about, if you have the federal model, that is interfered with and you get this other establishment hierarchy. Now, in terms of the federal model, obviously, you can think about the list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence. The federal model traces directly back to the colony's experience with the monarchy. Both on the federal side and the state side, in large measure running away from the crown, right? And whatever method of judicial selection, we just can't have that. That didn't work so well. And, most of us probably know we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created. I think it'd be important, good and big language. But in the grievances, the founders say expressly that King George, quote, has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries, end quote. And if you think about that grievance, right, the federal model is a direct response to that. So we're going to get away from the crown because that's the problem. So we're going to have it split, right? President nominates, advice and consent of the Senate. So we're going to have 2 bodies involved. In addition, you're going to have no reduction in pay while in office and a lifetime appointment effectively for good behavior. All those extremely important, right? It's trying to get some protection for the judiciary, and that still is. The pay issues, the tenure, the period of time they're going to serve, all very important. In the federal model, though, what's the check? Pretty much impeachment, right? You don't have a lot, and impeachment, as it turns on the federal side, hasn't proven to be all that helpful or effective. Early on, the Jeffersonian Republicans are going after the Federalists, right? They want a piece of them and want to weaken the judiciary. So you see Jeffersonian Republicans going after John Pickering, a federal judge out of New Hampshire, and convicting him. Right, and he's tried in the Senate and convicted for it. Then they go after Samuel Chase, Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He's impeached by the House. Even though the Jefferson Republicans have a 25-9 majority, that fails. He is not impeached. But you have that real threat of attack against the judiciary coming in, political check of some sort. And over time, though, it just hasn't done very much. You've had 15 federal judges impeached. Only 8 of those have been convicted in the history of it on the federal side. So what's going on the state side? Well, at the time of the founding, the majority of states adopt legislative appointments. 8 out of 15 go with legislative, 5 go with gubernatorial, and North Carolina, in Section 13 of its 1776 Constitution, goes with legislative appointment. That's what we have in place, and that's sort of the mainstay. Not a lot of concern about independence and accountability at the time of the founding for the judiciary, because if you remember Hamilton in Federal 78, talking about the judiciary is the quote-unquote least dangerous branch. It has neither force nor will, but merely judgment. It doesn't have the power of the purse. It doesn't have the power of the sword. So, they're there, important. Montesquieu talked about tyranny. We don't want that. Tyranny bad, right? So don't want that, but we're not overly worried about the independence and accountability. And so the judiciaries end up being pretty weak. And as we move in through the early part of the 19th century, you've got, I think, 3 factors that are really putting pressure on the legislative appointment system. You have the growth of Jacksonian democracy, right? So this shift from legal elites and elites generally to the people, giving power. That doesn't really permeate into the judicial side of things early on. Georgia adopts judicial elections for its lower courts in 1812. Mississippi does so for all of its courts in 1832. But you don't really see a massive shift under, well, Jackson's still around. The other thing, as I mentioned, is the Jeffersonian Republicans trying to weaken the judiciary, both federal and state, through impeachment, through shorter terms of office. They start shifting from lifetime tenure during good behavior to 6 and 8 year periods. You have what are called Ripper bills. Legislatures are passing these pieces of legislation and statutes that either divest the courts of all jurisdiction or replace the courts altogether. They just take them and go. So if you decide something I don't like, legislature has control. You're accountable directly to the legislature. They just replace you. Doesn't necessarily make you a very effective check on the judiciary. You also have a process called removal by address, where all you need is a majority or supermajority. They petition the governor can remove the judges. So the judges are really weak under the legislative system. You have the attacks from the Jefferson Republicans, and as we move towards the middle of the 19th century, what you see is a series of financial crises called the Panics of 1837 and 1839. Legislatures have been thinking about Erie Canal, thought to be big successful. States are going in massively spending on public works projects. Canals, roadways, railways. Debt is going through the ceiling. I mean, it's just massive debt. And then you have these financial panics in the United States and abroad, and all of a sudden you have massive default. You have the state scrambling and saying, wait a second, we have a real problem here. And a big part of the problem is that the judiciary is too weak. The judiciary does not have its own independence. It's under the thumb, if you will, of the legislature. We need to get rid of that. And how can you do that? Well, one way is judicial elections. And what you see, starting in 1846, New York State adopts judicial elections for all of its courts. And between that point and the start of the Civil War, 24 of 34 states have judicial elections of some sort, 20 for all their courts, 4 more for their lower courts. And so you have a massive shift, and North Carolina adopts that in 1868 as part of its Reconstruction Constitution, right? It goes along with judicial elections as part of it. So I think a very important shift, and again, it's independence, it's accountability, so not only want them independent, but we want them accountable, don't want them able to do whatever they want, like in the federal model. How can you do it? Well, one way to do it certainly is to have the people involved, right? It, again, has some problems, certainly has concerns, but I think plays an important role in the process. And I think, the palatability of judicial elections in large measure can vary depending on one's view of how political the judiciary is. I personally think the judiciary is very political. It doesn't mean that judges are politicians. They're not. But the judiciary is political, as we talked about with Garland and Gorsuch, those nominations. Or like I talked about Mr. Swing Vote, Justice Kennedy, right? Any 5-4 decision he's involved with is usually a pretty important controversial decision of some sort. There's a very political nature, and who should be able to determine when they get it right? You can do impeachment, again, very difficult now in general. You can do constitutional amendment if you don't like a decision, but again, federal side, very extremely difficult under Article 5, very difficult under state constitutions generally as well. This gives the people a way to play in. And we see this happen a lot in different issues now going on across the country. You may have retention elections in Iowa several years ago. That was certainly a big one. The tort reform actions that were going on in the 80s and 90s in Texas and Alabama. Both of those states had 9-0 Democrat majorities on the Supreme Courts. With tort reform and issues like that, it swung in about a 10-year period in each state to 9-0 Republican as well through the voters. Voters saying, you folks are interpreting our Constitution, striking down duly enacted legislation to restrict tort reform, and as we think that's wrong and bad and have a change, and the people have a direct voice in it. So look forward to questions and comments, and I turn it over to Professor Mccann. Okay, great. Thanks for having me. It's a nice big audience. It's nice to be back in North Carolina. You might have heard from my bio. In an earlier part of my life lived in North Carolina. Found my wife here. She's from Greensboro. Took her back north, but it was a good couple of years. So it's glad to be back. Beautiful weather. I'm very grateful to have a chance to speak on this issue. It's tough to get your comments down to 10 minutes. As I'm a faculty member, right? I never go less than 90 at any point in time. So I'm going to do my best and try to make a couple points worthwhile. Also have the chance to go third, which means I can kind of bounce off what the other two fellows have said and try to add something new to the conversation. So I was kind of taking notes along the way. What to talk about. So when I started putting together my notes, I realized this is a really complicated issue, a lot of different dimensions, right? And so the first thing I was trying to figure out was what to talk about, because the issue partisan versus nonpartisan, that takes you down one set of questions and points to discuss. And the issue of election versus appointment or alternative, it seems to be a different set of topics. Of course, state versus federal is a completely different set of questions that have to be answered. And you also have to think about the level. Are we talking about trial courts? Are we talking about appellate courts and high courts? So I'm going to focus, because we had some discussion about the election mechanism itself, I thought I'd focus a little bit on the issue of partisan versus nonpartisan elections. And maybe in Q&A we can talk more about the alternatives to elections. So thinking about partisan versus nonpartisan issue, I'm thinking about this in terms of throwing a rock into a lake, right? You have your immediate splash and then you have the ripples out. And so I'm going to focus first on the splash and then think about the ripples as they go out until Professor Lopez tells me to stop talking. I think what's the immediate, the most proximate change we're talking about is literally a little D or an R on the ballot, right? Is ultimately the direct thing we're talking about. And so as a full disclosure, as economists think about this, right? What we're talking about here is whether or not we should withhold information or not, right? My default position into any topic is more information strictly dominates less, right? And information is good. Unless you can convince me that there's some kind of negative externality that's so serious, right, that means that we need to withhold the information for some better outcome. So that's what I think about in terms of information. So to get after that externality question, I think we have to ask, well, what kind of information is being withheld, right? And I'm going to echo some of the things Chris already brought up, right, which is there's no doubt that this partisan tag is an informative cue for voters, right? This is something that they respond to, right? That they look at, whether right or wrong, whether we think that they should be paying attention to it is, well, I don't know if that's my business, right? But voters are interested in this information, right? And so I would ask, well, what kind of information are they, to get at this externality, what kind of information are we looking at here? So one you could think of is there's some kind of screening within the parties based on skills or abilities. That'd be awesome. Right, if parties were just working very hard to make sure the absolute best human beings were in these positions. I think we might be a little skeptical that's the only thing that's going on. But what else could they be screening on, right? One could be just ideology. They're putting the people who maybe have the right views. Or they could be screening on party favors, right? Who's good at fundraising, things like this. And ideology we probably care about. Most voters are affiliated, right? Independent voters are not that uncommon. So we have beliefs, we have ideological beliefs, and we like to have people who believe the same as us. So I'm not necessarily willing to argue against that. So we should also think about the opportunity costs are. You move from a nonpartisan to partisan system, you have this change. Well, absent the party cue, what would voters be using? What information would they be looking at, right? So I've started doing a little research on this, looking at different states. Florida, there's the thing for higher courts called retention elections, very different, but it's the idea the governor appoints somebody, and then the voters are given the question of, should we retain Judge Edward Lopez, right? Yes or no? There's not even a second person. You should absolutely keep Ed involved as much as possible, right? So the answer would be yes there. So if you they have nonpartisan retention elections, and so what's left on the ballot? Just their name, right? So that actually seems likely to make other things more salient, like gender, like name construction, like ethnicity, right? These are things I think would come to the forefront of voters' minds if you took away the bit of information that they're most interested in. So just looking at retention elections, you find that gender differences in votes received is quite large in these elections, right? So it's something to think about is what are they going to be making their choices on absent this party information. I also think about incumbency advantage. So this is something political scientists have studied for decades, right? For whatever reason, incumbents, well, for a number of reasons, incumbents tend to do pretty well at the polls, right? I love reading the local news, right? I'm one of those guys who, small town, I'm living in Morgantown, not a lot goes on. I love reading the local news, and mostly I'm interested in the crime in the courts, right? What's going on, who's getting a nasty sentence, who did what to whom. I love reading that stuff. And it's impossible, if you're a registered voter reading the local news, all you're seeing is your judge's name in there almost every day, right? And so if you don't have any other information than the name and you show up at the poll, you're going to see that judge you picked up in the news on that ballot. I would imagine incumbency advantage would be quite strong in a nonpartisan system. Okay, so that's the first, that's the rock. These are some concerns I have. Now let's start thinking about what's the first wave out. Now we've talked about voter information. I think about candidate entry and selection, right? So what do these races look like? I live in West Virginia, right? That's where I work now. And we just moved the opposite direction. In 2016, we just deleted partisan affiliation from our judges. So we're just crossing paths, just moving the opposite direction, you guys. Anecdotally, I just looked at some data of what happened in our 2016 elections, which was the last election cycle we had for our judges. The number of people who entered the race grew substantially, right? So this partisan tag, right, acts as an entry barrier, right? So some individuals who aren't necessarily good party insiders presumably expected that they have a shot now, right? And so you saw 3, 4, sometimes 5 people run for one judge position without that partisan affiliation, right? There was one county in West Virginia where the 5th place finisher in the judge election received more votes than the difference between number 1 and number 2, right? So you have a slight change in how many people are running in these plurality voting systems that we have, and you can see different outcomes, right? And also one wonders about campaign spending, right? When you've lost information to voters, do the candidates have to make that up through additional spending? And if you have more people, the aggregate spending could just increase as well. I've tried to research that issue a little bit, looking at, I like to do experimental economics. I go to the lab, have college students play games. It's kind of fun, right? You pay your students money, you get better student evaluations. It's a good thing to do. No, you shouldn't be doing that, but undergrads love getting $20 bills. So it's fun to do laboratory research in economics, right? And so I was trying to get at this issue by thinking about contests, elections as contests. There's a famous economist named Gordon Tullock who years ago studied things like rent seeking. He said we should think about this in terms of contests. So these Tullock contests are kind of fun to play. And so you say, well, imagine everybody can spend on some kind of contest. They'll have some big prize if they happen to be picked out of the hat. And so I was looking at, well, what if I gave one side the advantage, right? Like I would think about partisanship. If you're in a Republican-heavy area and you get to put little signs in people's lawns and the ads in the newspaper that say Republican, right, that dollar spent might be more effective than if you are, say, some third-party candidate who's trying to persuade people your way. And so it turns out people love to play. They're very competitive, right? People compete in terms of how much they spend in these laboratory games, way more than what theory predicts, which is too much compared to what would be welfare maximizing, right? So this kind of excessive competitiveness is a real issue in these competitions. And it turned out that those that have the advantage, like you would have having a partisan advantage, not only overcompeted relative to theory, but overcompeted relative to everybody else, right? They had the advantage that they spent a lot, right? And so one would imagine then that if it kind of has that external validity and applies to the real world, that if you drop this partisan tag, you might get some reduction in spending just because everybody's kind of the same playing field, so you're not already starting with a lead in the horse race, right? So I would worry about the spending and the entry issues when you're talking about what policies to have. And then the final question for selection is, who is it who ends up on the ballot? You got to be a good party insider to get your party's nod, right? Especially if there's not primary contests and local leaders kind of promote individuals with the money that the party has. So who is it that they're selecting? And that's where I think the biggest externality we're worried about, right, is that they're picking a different type of person in a partisan system that has a different set of beliefs, right? But we should probably also ask about in a nonpartisan system, how do judges get picked, right? What does that selection mechanism look like? Does it mean running around getting a lot of signatures, right? I'm not sure, right? I don't know enough about that, but we should be worried about who it is who's running for these offices, and whether we're so concerned about the partisanship in the selection issue, right, that we should abandon it. Okay, and I still have a few minutes left, so I'll get to one last point. So I'm thinking about the next ripple out, not just selection, but then actual behavior on the bench, right? I think once we've had selection, we can step back out. And we should think of judges as malleable human beings, right? It's probably not correct to think of them as just ideological robots who simply implement party line whenever they have some discretion. That's probably not the right way to think about them. They have their opinions. They were selected there for a reason, but they're malleable. So I think about one research paper that I found quite interesting, a woman named Joanna Shepard down at Emory. She was looking at high court judges across the U.S. and the different modes that they were selected. And what she found was that she looked at typical partisan positions, like in labor management disputes, whether the high court judge voted for labor management, or environmental disputes, things that you can say are stereotypical Republican or Democrat positions, okay? And it took, so there, if you're a judge who was appointed by a governor who's Republican or voted by a voting body who tends to like Republicans, then you'll be more pro-business in environmental case, more likely to be pro-management labor dispute, as you would expect for ideology. But in the middle of the term, if the governor changes party, if you have Democrats come in within that state, you see, or the voting body, if it's an elected situation, starts putting Democrats into office, you'll actually see judges start switching their votes in the middle of their term, right? Because the retention agent, the new governor, whoever's going to decide to keep them in the job, has switched, right? So it's not just robot ideological individuals, but people interested in keeping their jobs, right? And making decisions that the new voting public is interested in. And so this partisanship can potentially affect, right, the decisions of the judges along the line. So I'll stop there, keep it within time, but I look forward to questions afterwards. Thanks.
I want to first of all say thank you to John Locke Foundation for having me today. Even if it was a last-minute invite, I think the fact that I'm going last is fitting because these three guys are a lot smarter than I am about this subject. So given the preparation time and the fact that I'm among the intellectual giants here, I'm going to keep my remarks sort of limited to a few of the things that I've written on paper here. I don't typically do that when I'm teaching class, as some of my former students will attest to. As Professor Bono said, there is no perfect method of selecting state judges. All have their advantages and flaws. For me, the best system is the one that we have, the election of state judges by the citizenry through partisan election campaigns. Now, I want to add one more consideration to the list that Professor Bono gave you. For me, the dispositive factor is that state judges make law. They do that in two ways. First, all judges, both federal and state, make law when they interpret broad or vague terms in constitutions, statutes, or regulations. But state law judges make law in another way that distinguishes them from federal judges. They make the common law. Our rules of contract, property, and tort law originally were created by judges, and judges continue to make many of those rules today. After all, those of you who have been to law school know that for the most of your first year in law school, you study judge-made law. Judge-made law is common law. And state court judges, especially the appellate judges, make law. Now, I believe that lawmakers should be directly elected by and accountable to the people. And as long as state judges make law as common law judges, I think they should be elected by the people. I think that is the method that best reflects the ideal of state government. It is not a perfect method, but I do think that it is better than the alternatives. Now, I want to add one thing, because one of the common criticisms about the partisan election method is that voters typically in judicial elections are not terribly well informed by about which candidates they should vote for. And I think that is a function of a number of different things, but one of the things that I think that we need to take another look at, and that is the question of judicial campaign speech. To the extent that judges make law, voters have a right to know what kind of law they make. Now, you've heard judicial candidates say this, well, I can't comment on issues that might come up in future cases, or my personal views, don't affect my judging. Well, all judges come to the bench with certain views, and it's neither possible nor desirable to select judges who have no preconceptions about what the law should be. So when a judicial candidate says that he or she has no ideology or agenda, that the candidate is either naive, lying, or empty-headed. Unfortunately, most judicial candidates refuse to disclose their preconceived views. Now, I think it's important to the proper functioning of the electoral system when you're with respect to judicial candidates, that judicial candidates take advantage of the opportunities they have to tell voters about their views. My question is, why deny voters this information? Impartiality does not require it. While judicial candidates cannot comment on specific cases they eventually might hear, and should not promise how they will rule in future cases, they are free to disclose their views on broader political and legal issues without violating ethics rules. Back in the early part of the 2000s, I was a member of the North Carolina Supreme Court Advisory Committee on Permissible Judicial Campaign Speech. And this was a committee that the North Carolina Supreme Court put together after the Supreme Court's decision in Republican Party versus White, which held that judicial campaign speech was protected speech under the First Amendment. And North Carolina has some of the perhaps the most liberal ethics rules for judges, modeled after the Supreme Court's decision, Republican versus White, that permit judicial campaign speech consistent with those First Amendment protections. Some candidates still refuse, though, to divulge their preconceived views on the ground that such views are never going to be relevant to their judging. Well, that's simply not true. The most difficult cases require a judge to weigh competing interests in a particular matter. This balancing of interests inevitably calls for judicial value judgments. Those value judgments are guided by the judge's preconceived views about what the law should be. And to go back even further, those preconceived views typically are shaped by a judge's moral, social, and religious principles, or by his or her personal experience. Now, people may disagree over whether this is legitimate, but I think it's unavoidable. What impartiality does require is that a judge be open-minded. And impartiality is better served, I think, by judges who do not hide their views, but are willing to consider views that oppose their preconceptions and to remain open to being persuaded toward different views when they arise in a particular case. And I think in judicial elections, voters are much better served by having more rather than less information about the candidate's views. Since a judge's preconceived views will affect his or her judging, at least in some cases, voters, I think, have a legitimate concern in being informed ahead of time about what those views are. Now, I think that was why I was disappointed to see the North Carolina legislature in the early 2000s go to nonpartisan elections, because that deprived voters of even the most basic indicator about a candidate's views, the party affiliation. When judicial candidates then refuse to disclose anything about their views, most voters are left with little more to guide their choices than general reputation, experience, work habits, and factors that really provide little help in distinguishing the candidates. So I think that a system of partisan judicial elections is the best system, but I would add, too, that I think we need more judges who are willing to take advantage of the broad ethical rules we have here in North Carolina and their First Amendment protected speech and communicate more about their views so that voters will be more informed in these elections. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for those those presentations. We're getting, I think, very far down the road and having a good discussion about this issue. As a moderator, I'll be taking questions from the floor as well as be giving the panelists an opportunity to respond to those, as well as respond to 2 points that I'd like to introduce that haven't been covered yet. On the question of elections versus appointment, as Brian very handily distinguished for us, that's a different set of issues to discuss, overlapping but still different set of issues to discuss compared to partisan versus nonpartisan elections. We haven't discussed performance of the legal system under election versus non-election. I do agree with Chris that there's no single model that works for all states. And just because a model works in some other state doesn't mean that that's what we should do in North Carolina. We have our own decision to make, and we have our own decision as to how to weigh the priority of independence against the priority of accountability. And that's a decision for North Carolinians to make. But Chris also said that that decision should be informed by the facts. And a lot of social science research does generate what are pretty close to facts, at least data that as we understand it currently, on how legal systems perform under election versus under appointment. And you can look at, for example, the overall reputation of the legal system among the legal profession. So a recent national survey of 1,321 practicing attorneys, North Carolina ranked 33rd out of 50 in overall quality of the legal system. And that is down 26 spots from the state's 7th place ranking in the 2015 version of that study. Why the big drop? Research suggests that the reason we've dropped in that ranking is due to the switch to partisan judicial elections. One study by economists Russ Sobel, Matt Ryan, and Josh Hall happened to appear in my 2010 book, The Pursuit of Justice, Law and Economics of Legal Institutions. These authors estimate that switching from nonpartisan to partisan elections would cost a state 6 points in this national survey. 6 points works out to exactly the number of places that North Carolina dropped, 26 from one year to the next. So reputation of the legal system is one thing that may be a factor to consider. But there are also other aspects as well. Social science research on the 50 states indicates that that measures of corruption in government are adversely affected under elected judges compared to appointed. Criminal convictions tend to spike before elections. Is this the way that an impartial normative analysis of our legal system would prefer that it works? Do we really want criminal convictions to be affected by the proximity of the decision to an election? And evidently nothing else. In tort law, another area where performance is affected, the economists Eric Helland and Alex Tabarrok have a book on torts, and in that book they analyze hundreds of thousands of data points and find that in elected systems, tort decisions are orders of magnitude higher than in appointed systems, which affects the business climate in the state. This is not an argument for one or the other. This is a suggestion that evidence like this, data like this, if you want to treat it as facts like this, fits into the argument and may be of consideration for us today. Second point involves the question of disclosing information. Perhaps there is something as a non-ideologue, somebody who doesn't identify as a liberal or conservative, but they're qualified and they seek a judgeship. If we have a partisan ballot, that person is essentially, we're not going to tell that person to withhold their information. We're going to tell that person we're going to elicit information where it isn't there. And so what do we do with that potential reality? In addition, if they don't identify as Democrat or Republican, but perhaps as some other party member, or perhaps as nonpartisan at all, what do we do with the potential for those qualified individuals seeking a judgeship under partisan elections? So with those 2 points added to the discussion, I'll invite questions from the floor, and as well, I'll invite panelists to respond to those questions as well as to the 2 points that I've made.
Hello. I'll just ask really loud. Professor Wallace, I found your comments about judges having the ability to say certain things but not taking advantage of that freedom of speech that they had in North Carolina interesting. Do you think even if judges knew that, and perhaps they don't, perhaps they do, would they still, as a campaign mechanism, want to remain at least somewhat silent or not stake themselves out on that? And do you think that that's a good campaign strategy in any way?
Well, I guess it depends on whether they think their views are going to be sufficiently popular to get them elected. I think a lot of times judges don't want to tell you what their views are because they don't think that the majority of the people adhere to those views or want those views represented in their court system. So it's an easy out for them to say, well, I'm not going to comment on this because as a judicial candidate, I can't comment on possible cases that might come before me. We've heard that on a number of occasions. I'm not calling for an all-out political campaign here, but I do think judges need to give us more information than they do about their views. And I don't want to get too far, but I mean, we're talking here about judicial elections versus other methods of selection. I'm just saying that I think one of the things that will facilitate the election method is a broader commitment to judicial campaign speech on a part of judges and judicial candidates.
Any follow-up? Other side of the
I
room.
can be just as loud as Alex. I'm curious about your responses to what Professor Lopez put on the table, the arguments against elected judges on the grounds of reputational effects on the judiciary and the question of corruption. You have an elected process, is it more corrupt? But is this empirical evidence compelling to you? Is it persuasive to you? What are your responses?
I'm glad you asked. So I'll start, and then I suspect Scott will want to jump in. So we talk about performance. There are a lot of different ways to measure judicial performance. I will say that in terms of the quality of judges you get on the bench, in terms of the diversity of judges you get on the bench, there are no systematic differences between elected judges and appointed judges. That's about a wash. Now, in terms of reputation, I'm less concerned with reputation in the legal community as a political scientist than I am with legitimacy of the court. That is, do members of the public view the court as legitimate? That is, do they view this court as having the power to make the decisions they make and will follow them? And political scientists, particularly Jim Gibson, has done a bunch of experiments looking at legitimacy and tracing legitimacy over the course of a campaign. That is, asking the same individuals before a campaign, during a campaign, after a campaign. And what he finds is, in fact, that elections have a legitimacy conferring capacity on the court. That is, people view the court as more legitimate after the election than they did before. Now, this is not to say that there aren't problems, and particularly perceptions of impropriety with the campaign finance and so on exert a cost. They do. But the net effects are a benefit. This is also not to say if you were to go to a state like my home state of Connecticut and all of a sudden institute elections, there wouldn't be a legitimacy problem. There might be, because we've never elected judges in Connecticut. And people there, when you talk about this, they look at you like, this is like third world kind of stuff, right? And so there may have been a legitimacy cost that's already been paid by the states that have chosen to do it this way since, the 1850s. But this is just how things are done in those states. The other thing I think it's important to distinguish, and Greg got into this a little bit about policy-making courts. It's entirely defensible, and I would argue good, to have different methods of selection based on different methods of court, based on different levels of court. That is, the appellate courts are policy-making courts for all the reasons that Greg talked about that we all know. Trial courts are much less policy-making courts. Right, and so we talk about criminal convictions and civil verdicts and so on at the trial court level. I think of trial courts much less as policy-making bodies than they are case processing bodies. Not to denigrate what they do, but it's different than what state appellate courts do. And so appointing judges that are much more bureaucratic in nature strikes me as about right. And I guess the final response before I turn it over to my colleagues, and Ed made a good point about the non-ideologue, and what do we do with the non-ideologue who would run or whatever else. I would submit that a non-ideologue is not going to be appointed either. Then in any state where the governor or legislature is appointing, they're not going to appoint a non-ideologue either. So if you're a non-ideologue, sorry, join the academy. Not the judgeship.
I don't know if they'll let you in there either.
I would agree in terms of the politics, right? There are politics involved in any selection method. I mean, Chief Justice Roberts didn't become the Chief Justice because he didn't care about politics. He didn't plan his future. He didn't think about what's going to work, what's going to be important for him to get recognition. Even in terms of pressure on judges, if it's election or reappointment or retention elections, whatever it may be, they still have to worry about their standing in the community, right? The judges are concerned at one level about being accepted, right? The legitimacy of the court's going to rely at some level of the decisions being palatable. Not that everybody has to agree with them, but there has to be some awareness of that as we go forward. So I think that's going to be important. In terms of different methods, I think that's certainly a viable alternative, right? The lower courts have a built-in check. So you appeal, you just keep going up, and then you get to the policymakers, and then the policymakers, you can have the check with respect to elections, which I think can be useful on it. And the other thing, I mentioned, it's important to think about it, the spike of, criminal convictions or other things. Now, is that because judges haven't been enforcing the law properly, and now they're coming up to elections, so they're going to, or are they over-enforcing it? Had it been a correcting for under, or is it a shift to over? And that could vary from state to state, locale to locale. I mean, but it's the type of thing we need to think about and look at. Some judges may not be applying the law the way that folks think it should be applied. And now the elections, they're coming on the heels of an election or a retention election or reappointment, and they change their tune, just like I think Brian was talking about, the governor switches, the governor's office switches, and all of a sudden judges switch. They're doing different things. There is that self-interest that we all can't help. I mean, maybe some of us are immune from it, I'm probably not, in terms of our jobs and careers. And so that's just going to be a factor. And again, where do we put the politics? Where do we find it? How do we address it? And what's the best way to have it in the open and in full view for people to see? I think that's, to me, more important, because there are politics all over the place. The judiciary is political. I don't think there's any way, from my view, any way to get around that. And you can think about it, is Justice Thomas the same as Justice Ginsburg? No, right? I mean, do you care if they're originalists, or do you care if they're a purposivist or a living, breathing constitutionalist? I mean, presumably you care at some level. I mean, it's a spectrum. It's not just necessary, but it matters to me where they are. How it matters to me is certainly going to be different than it may be for you, but it certainly matters, and it leads to different outcomes, different decisions. And I do think, consistent with what Greg's talking about, better to have that information. As going back to your question earlier, Justice Scalia talking about Republican Party versus Minnesota versus White. If a judge is a complete tabula rasa, right, that's a problem, and they're going in for a lot of folks. If they have no views and then no thoughts on the nature of judging and what it is to do constitutional interpretation or a statutory construction, that's really problematic. They should have views. We don't want it being bought off like justice for sale, but again, I may contribute to somebody because I think they share my judicial philosophy, and I want to see that implemented. I'm not asking them to buy their vote. I want them to vote just the way I think they're going to vote. That's what I like about them, and so that could be an important feature as well.
So the one thing that Ed brought up that I thought was interesting, worth talking about, and Scott just kind of mentioned it to a degree, is the intertemporal nature of outcomes of the criminal justice system. So full disclosure, in the last 8 years, most of my research has actually been on prosecutors. It'd be awesome if we had a similar type thing talking about the fact that the U.S. uses popular partisan elections for those guys as well, when no other country in the world does that either. So I hope we can have that conversation, right? But
That's the next event.
good, awesome, right? Because no one ever pays attention to them. They are the ones that have all the discretion with the lower courts anyway. But data, whether you're looking at judges or prosecutors, right? The decision making has a pattern to it. Right, when you would hope from a rule of law perspective that things would not be influenced by extra legal factors like the personal career objectives of the individuals that are serving the public, right? But they absolutely do, right? We see sentencing get much harsher when judges are up for election. Prosecutors who have a lot of discretion, we see more jury trials and less plea bargaining when these guys are up for re-election, right? Those are just a few of the distortions that exist. And so this is Scott's point I thought was a good one, is I don't know what that means exactly, that the fact that there's some degree of cycle to them. Should we extend the length of these terms, right? I mean, you bring up Madison before, right, in the foundations of the U.S. The Supreme Court has no retention concerns whatsoever, right? And it's one of the few, I think there are a few states, maybe Rhode Island, who does not have any type of retentions for their high court. But, just how long should those terms be? In New York State, their low court judges serve 14 years before they run for re-election, right? Presumably, the designers thought that this cycling was an issue, right? But then the accountability versus the trade-off that has been discussed before. If they're never accountable to the voters, right, is that kind of smooth 14 years of no change in outcomes? Is that something we want to promote or not, right? And that's a tough question, but an interesting observation, I think.
Greg, would you like to weigh in?
What they said.
Okay, good. Yeah, good. No, I just think that, these remarks, I think, do great service to the purpose of our event. And, Chris bringing up the legitimacy point is important. It adds to, it sort of, in some ways, validates Brian's opening remark that it's complicated. We've got accountability, we've got, independence, we've got legitimacy, and I just would encourage the thought that legitimacy, like politics, might not always fit neatly on a single dimension. And legitimacy could be informed by the very performance of the system itself. So if you could, when you're posing a question, please identify yourself. Given the size of the room, that might be helpful. Please.
I'm Phyllis Muller. Are you suggesting that we could have it both ways? For the trial courts, we could have them appointed, and the others, since there's appeals, and for the others, we elect them?
Yes, I mean, in some states do that. So New York does it actually opposite. They elect their trial court judges and appoint their appellate judges, but having multiple methods of selection within a state based on level of court is not unheard of. There are other states that do it too. I'm not entirely sure what they are, but yes, that's certainly something states have done, and I would, that's something that people should look into if that's something that interests them.
Kansas actually varies within its own state.
Right.
Well, it depends on what county you live in, whether your judges are appointed or elected.
Yeah, Arizona as well.
So a lot of people love to study Kansas for that reason.
Yeah, it's like half and half in Kansas.
Yeah.
And I think there are obviously differences between the judiciary and the other branches, but within the judiciary itself, I mean, different states also have different levels. I mean, it's not all the same in terms of district superior. Yeah, what the nature of the intermediate appellate courts? Is it just one appellate court? Is it a criminal one, civil? So you have variations. I don't think there's any problem with thinking about the differences and how they make a difference. Right? What is the difference? As Chris was talking about before, if you're really worried about the policy-making component, and I think that is an important feature, as Greg was talking about in his opening remarks, right? That's critically important. So maybe we just worry about it where policy is made, and if it's only certain levels. Now that could also depend then, are our appellate courts doing a lot of the policy-making or not? Like in North Carolina, our Supreme Court doesn't hear that many cases. I haven't checked in the last couple of years, but from 2000 until 2015, we were in a steady decline in number of cases heard. So the appellate courts are really doing a lot of the work. They were not being reviewed by the North Carolina Supreme Court. In that case, much more concerned with having the appellate court also be accountable to the people. If you have a situation where a Supreme Court's doing the laboring and doing most of it and reviewing lots of cases, then the appellate courts may not matter so much. But you need to look at your particular situation, I think, see how the courts are operating, and then make a determination in relation to that.
And we do have a few notable trial court judges here in North Carolina that are making policy as well.
And just to jump in on that one, right? I would say that the lower courts, it's a different type of policy that they're interested in, right? In West Virginia, we have things like, well, everybody does. We're constantly talking about the opioid epidemic in the U.S., right? And so one of the so questions about use of alternative sentencing, right? Whether we're going to prosecute the suppliers of people who overdose, right? These are basically policy choices that are being made at the lowest level of courts. Use of deferred prosecution, things like this. So it's a different type of policy, but I think at the lower courts you're seeing some important decisions being made as well.
I think it's true, but then you have some built-in checks on it if you need it or want to. Whereas the state Supreme Court, provided it's not a federal constitutional issue, a federal statute, you're not going to get any higher review. It's just going to stop right there. And again, in North Carolina, a lot of it's just going to stop at our Court of Appeals, and it's never going to be reviewed.
Right, and that last point could be a feature if it's the case that we want to give greater weight to the independence criterion at higher courts and greater weight to the accountability criterion at lower courts. So, yes, sir, in the middle.
I'm Bill Lynch. Is this on? Oh, sir, I'm Bill Lynch. I'd like to think that there are plenty of people in the state, lawyers in the state who are qualified to be judges, that legally qualified. But I also tend to think that the voters are never going to be able to tell whether somebody is ethically qualified, not motivated by politics. So my feeling is that what you need to do is to have the legal community set up candidates who you say are qualified candidates legally. And the Democrats and the Republicans and amongst yourselves, you can winnow that down to 10 names, whatever. And then there is a random pick. You've got these 10 people who are really qualified, and you've winnowed them down and got rid of the guys who are whatever, you know. And so you pick them. You just pick them, and one of them gets the job. And if you want to have people vote, you pick two of them. And you're almost surely to get two better qualified candidates than the system that we have now. You do want people who are ethically qualified too.
Well, I think there are a couple of things to say. I think when you have partisan elections with the parties involved, the parties have an incentive to not nominate jokers because they want to protect their party brand. So you do have that kind of check. Now, it doesn't always work perfectly, right? And you do get jokers. But look, we get jokers at all levels of government, all levels. So the second thing I would say is I get nervous when, and this is so I'm not a lawyer, and I get nervous around legal elites winnowing things down, because what ends up happening, and what the data has shown, is, and Brian Fitzpatrick's done some good work on this, legal elites tend to replicate themselves both ideologically and demographically. And so we tend to get a list of best qualified people, right, that, well, honestly look like this panel. White dudes. And I think that's not good. It's not good for the court. It's not good for the state. It's not good for politics. It's not good for anything. I think your first point that there are a large number of qualified people is absolutely right. And there are a large number of qualified people for every judgeship. So the notion that there's like one best qualified or best candidate, I think, is not true. And so what I think, we need to be careful of is making sure that we have a process that gets highly qualified candidates. And we can do this legislatively at the front end. So, for example, you can every state has qualifications to be on the state court, which is interesting because the federal government does not, right? Anyone can be on a federal court. But every state has qualifications to be on a state court. If we're concerned with the quality of candidates we're getting, we can change those things. So, for example, you could certainly have a thing in there that if you've been disciplined in the past 5 years, you can't run for a state courtship. Just like you have to practice law for a period of years. Or you have to be a resident of a state for a certain number of years or anything else. Right? Those I think we can get rid of, we can do easily, right, to get rid of these bad candidates in a way that's not that doesn't risk inclusiveness of an open process.
Well, I am a lawyer, and I do share your same unease with the
Means you're not a lead.
lawyers selecting the process. That's worked out real well in a fine, nonpartisan way with the ABA recommendation process for federal judicial candidates.
And I think that type of process, you got to worry about accountability. So if you have a commission of some sort, and this would be a sort of a Missouri plan or merit-based system, the vast majority of those committees are unelected. And so, especially if you're just going to choose, I'm not sure who's going to choose, but how do you hold those folks accountable, right? And a lot of the states have professors, yeah, that's what we're here for. You have a lot of these situations where the bar has a privileged status, and you can imagine if you're a layperson, if you really want lay participation, then you can get in elections. And if I'm on a medical board or some type of panel, and I've got a bunch of doctors telling me something, I don't know about you, for me, I'm going with the medical doctor, right? So it tends to skew, and as you mentioned, if you're interested, Brian Fitzpatrick does have some good work on Missouri and Tennessee, how it has shifted the ideological preference. So I think you need to watch out for that. And also in terms of what counts as merit, there's just a lot of different views on what it means to have merit. Two of the leading folks who have been colleagues of mine, I'm very fortunate to work with, who've been pushing for nomination commissions in the state, had an op-ed a few years ago and talking about they were looking for things I think a lot of folks will agree on, things like independence, integrity, reverence, but then talk about open-mindedness and an understanding heart. Those were qualifications they want in a judge. I don't know what that means. I mean, it could be really good. It could scare me to death. I don't know. Depends on the situation. But merit can be so open-ended that way as to what I value and as a committee member. And if I can get capture of that committee and I'm unelected, there's no check on me whatsoever. So that makes me twitchy when it comes to Missouri plans.
I just had fun fact. The original democracy, ancient Athens, right, had their judges picked by lottery as well. They served one-year terms, but they were random selection, so there is some precedent.
Oh, and that would be a perfectly defensible choice if North Carolina wanted to do that.
I think maybe things are tough all over. I think that social change surrounds the response that what would legal elites end up selecting. Numerous professions, including the economics profession, are taking very hard, tangible steps to increase inclusivity and more representation of the people in the profession at whole. So we could maybe count on that as well. We're coming up on the limit of our time, so I think we might have an appetite for one or two more questions. Yes, sir, in the middle. Please identify yourself.
You didn't mention how the judges feel. We've heard a lot about elections having those voice. I like the third option where you have a Senate scrutinize the individual who's appointed by a governor, and that's the way the federal system works. And if we have a problem as citizens with our senator, let's say Tillis of Burr, we could vote them out. I'm saying the Senate has a better grasp of how to go through who should be on the court than I do. All I know is I'm probably going to vote for the guy with the most signs. And I like the third option. And do you have a problem with that?
Well, I think that the evidence suggests that you do better than you think you do. And so, we've done some empirical studies looking at can voters determine, so if you look at all the incumbents who are running and the ones who are challenged, can voters determine whether or not a challenger is qualified to defeat that incumbent? And by quality, what we did is we measured whether or not the challenger had prior lower court experience. So in the universe of incumbents who are challenged, you have some challengers who have lower court experience, some who were just attorneys with no experience. Now, they may be very good, right? But again, we don't know. And what we found actually is that challengers with prior lower court experience do about 4.6 points better than challengers without such experience. Voters do okay, and they certainly do just as well in judicial elections as they do in senatorial elections or state legislative elections or in these other elections. So you might not know the finer points of every detail, but most of those things don't matter, right? I mean, I would submit that you don't know the finer points of your state legislative candidate or state senate. And if you do know the finer points, I would humbly suggest you're spending too much time doing research because you don't need to know all that stuff, right? Voters can make meaningful choices in these elections as they can distinguish between qualified alternatives and non-qualified alternatives. And that should give us comfort. And what I guess a final comment on the federal system is I would say, I don't know if maybe my colleagues are different. I would not describe the federal system as a system that's working very well, right? I would describe it as a system that's in fact not working well at all, where you have waiting times for appellate court confirmations, of 100 to 200 plus days. You have some candidates who can't get a vote. You have no accountability at all because of lifetime tenure. I mean, I know that judges like lifetime tenure, and I get in trouble for saying this, but they ain't professors. We get lifetime tenure. Right? Judges, you know, except if you're a federal judge, they don't. And so I think we tend to underestimate voters.
We have time for one quick last question.
Just one more.
Yep. Please identify yourself.
Jason Spriggs. I drove from Henderson.
Great.
I would go with the existing system of partisan elections. And the reason I say that from a voter standpoint, it allows that appearance of voters actually being involved in the election themselves. Because what I know and what I believe is this discussion is good, but it's not really about the voters at all. It's about interest. There's a lot of interest and interest groups involved in this whole process. That's why there's so much change over the years back and forth. But to just allow the voters to believe that they are heavily involved in who they're selecting, partisan, you know, choose a side, left or right, and give them that decision. Because like I said, at the beginning and end of the day, we know voters, they do vote, but there's not a lot of power in the hands of the voters. It has to do with the party on the right or the left, kind of what the party chooses to do with it.
Thank you. Would any of the panelists like to respond? Okay. Well, listen, I would like to conclude by encouraging you to go back to your colleagues in your neighborhoods and discuss the issues that came before us today and contribute to the public discussion. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to our co-sponsors and our hosts, and especially thank you to our distinguished panelists.
Thank you, Ed. Let me just add my thanks to our panelists, to Dr. Lopez, to all of you for being here. Let me just remind you quickly, too, that the John Locke Foundation has a weekly Shaftesbury Society discussion, usually over in our office. If you'll fill out the card that was put at your place, we will get you an invitation to that each week so that you can know what's coming up. Also get you a free subscription to Carolina Journal so you can keep up with this issue and lots of other things that are going on. Thank you all so much.